Welcome to the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. Each week, Matt, Curt, Jerry, and the occasional special guest explore how the trauma-informed paradigm challenges traditional beliefs and approaches concerning a wide variety of areas. This podcast addresses psychological trauma in an educational manner and is not designed to replace mental health treatment. If anything in this podcast makes you feel uncomfortable or anxious, please talk to a mental health professional.
Welcome, friends, to episode 58 of the Trauma Informed Lens podcast. I'm Matt. I'm here with Curt and Jerry today. So, as you know, if you've been listening along and this isn't your first time, we had a little technical difficulty. And so I recorded our first mini episode for last week on the topic we're going to talk more about today, which is the role of supervision in creating and maintaining a trauma-informed environment. So I would really encourage you, if you're just coming into this episode and you didn't listen to episode 57, please do, because I sort of set up this episode hopefully in a fairly succinct way. So we're going to pick up the discussion there, and I'm excited to get Jerry and Curt's thoughts on this as well. When we tried to record this with our technology disaster a couple weeks ago, I was going in and out, but heard some great discussion that I'm excited to pick back up. So as always, we start out with our bright, shiny objects of the week. Jerry, you're on the road today. You want to get us started?
Yeah, I had the pleasure of attending a 2-day workshop with Jack Kornfield this week. And talking about mindfulness and talking about the combination of having compassion for the people that we treat and the people we interact with, but combining that with self-compassion, and that without self-compassion, it doesn't complete the circle. And, really, I think it really speaks a lot to the topic we're going to talk about today of being able to, so much of the work of working with individuals who have been exposed to some type of emotional injury, bring that pain to us to kind of hold, and that the difference between being empathetically connected to them and being compassionate for them is a subtle difference, but really allows us to be thinking about what can we do to relieve their stress. And so, I think this topic today of talking about how do we help the individuals that are doing this incredible work really have time to reflect on their own experience and being able to digest it, being able to kind of reflect on what it does to them, for them, and then how to effectively respond, as opposed to being organized by the experience. So I was really, I enjoyed the time I had to kind of sit and reflect with Jack Kornfield this week.
Very cool, very cool. Curt, what about you? What's your bright, shiny object of the week?
I have a couple, actually. I'll start with next week is our conference keynote and breakout. So I'm excited about that and have been kind of prepping my portion of that and have been enjoying that, kind of doing some organizing of what material I want to produce and having to make it succinct and to the point, and just kind of enjoying that process. And as a part of that, I found a pretty decent book, I think, by Alan Alda of MASH fame, right? And yeah. He's a great storyteller and a great actor, and so he has a little book that he wrote, and I think the title was really cool. The title was called, it's about communication. The title was, "If I Understood You, Would I Have This Look on My Face?" So I thought it's really pretty funny. And it was, it's all about how to communicate effectively with others, how to tell stories so that people understand what you're saying and that you can connect with other people. And he makes the point, and even when you're giving a presentation, say, to a very large audience, creating a connection between you and the audience is really important. So that's been something that I've been thinking a lot about, is social connectedness, and how important that is in so many different contexts, which is kind of the point of our presentation at this conference. So it's been on my mind a lot, and that was a fun book, a fun little. I've read most excerpts from it. I haven't sat down and read the whole thing, but I've gotten some good information from it. And then thinking about kind of reflecting on some of people that I have had the pleasure of supervising or been involved with in work relationships over the years. I got to meet with a former supervisee last week and just kind of reflect on our experience as coworkers and colleagues, and talk a little bit about that we might want to do something more like that in the future. So that was really fun to reflect on and enjoy the kind of the process of being a supervisor, and hear about his process of being a supervisee and our ability to engage with one another. And that was really enjoyable to do. So we spent an afternoon together last week, and it was really great. It reminded me of how much I enjoy that part of my job and my work.
Very cool. I'll finish up with mine. I'll be brief because it'll probably be mine for depending on when we connect next week as well. But I've just been on the road constantly. Basically, I think it's been around 6 weeks. So spending a lot of time in airports, in hotel rooms, and I don't know, it just really is cool to work with so many different people. I know I may not get them all in before this episode goes live, but we'll have a lot of new people on our email list. So if we get any new ones from my last trip, welcome for your first episode. But just really cool, no matter kind of what type of organization I'm working with, whether it's a school, a health clinic, or juvenile justice or wherever it is, just so many great people doing so much great work out there. So I just kind of in my exhaustion before I jump on a plane again tomorrow, I just want to thank some of our new listeners, and I know we've got a bunch more coming in as well. So welcome to my new friends around the country. And welcome to the podcast. So let's get started around the supervision issue. And again, I laid out my arguments of why I thought this was, if we're going to say and I always like to say again, trauma-informed is more of a journey than a destination. But if we're going to go on that journey, I'd really like to, start out, maybe, Jerry, getting some of your thoughts because, hey, you've supervised me in the past, poor guy. I just kind of would love to get kind of following up on my thoughts, some of your guys' thinking on again, we see a rich, if you look in behavioral health and social work, we'll see a very rich supervision sort of models in those things. And a lot of the best practices carry a lot of supervision expectations. But I would argue in a lot of positions that are just as intense as my work as a therapist or a case manager is, don't get much, if any, sort of structured supervision. And so, Jerry, I'd just kind of like to get your thoughts on how, as a leader, you've utilized and kind of your philosophy of supervision and why it's so important in our trauma-informed thinking.
Well, there's this the drive not to recapitulate a prior experience, but to be open to this kind of present experience in a positive way. And so many times we're dealing with people who either have histories of living in chaos or living with high levels of stress and having the relational environment not be responsive to them. And so the staff, whether it be a teacher, a nurse, or a police officer, or a mental health worker, is interacting with that individual. And the hope is that the person coming to that scene is the more mature, better regulated nervous system to help to manage the pain, to hold the pain, and regulate the intensity of the interaction. And that that is really a challenging task, right? It's a very draining task. And, you know, Curt talked about that in several episodes about how really being cognitively present is metabolically costly. It's a very, and exhausting, right? And so, you know, I think the process of supervision is a place to kind of be moving out of your kind of emotional place back to your place that you can reflect on your experience rather than being reactive to your experience. And I think that you know, the concept of supervision, although mental health, I think that we create this, you know, for this place that I like to call this sacred place, where you come in for a particular time, and I intentionally pay attention to you. I don't answer my phone. I'm really there to kind of read your signals, kind of reflect back to how I see what your experience is, so that I create a space for you to kind of reflect on that. But in many of the places where people interact with clients who are in these kind of painful states, that's not the way their practice goes, right? And so really how you define supervision, to me, is having somebody who is interacting with you, whose main intention is to kind of pay attention to your experience, not to their experience. And so, you know, I think that when I was raising my children, I didn't stop and have a supervisory interaction, right? But my partner periodically was there to help me reflect on my experience rather than paying attention to their experience. And I think that that's really important, that if we're going to start, the ideal would be is you have an hour and you go away and you sit. But really is, how do we create these opportunities in all of our environments that we're working in, to understand that periodically I need somebody who's there really not kind of being preoccupied with their internal state and their needs, but really focused on mine, and helping me to manage mine. And so what that looks like could be a principal coming into a classroom, or it could be a peer who's meeting with me and doing some peer reflecting and coaching to kind of do it. And so we have the ideal, which is this hour of mental health supervision. And then we have the other extreme where there is no supervision, there is no opportunity. How do we, in these trauma-informed environments, move towards the ideal, but understanding the limitations of the environment that it protects to? So I want to leave our listeners with some hope to think, oh, I'm a teacher, I'll never get to this place where once a week I go to do it. But that doesn't mean you can't have a kind of a place or a relationship where you can have this reflective experience for you as well.
Great points. Curt, how's this play into your thinking in the various settings that you've worked with in your career?
Well, part of, I think, Jerry, what you were helping us to kind of understand a little bit about how our brains and our bodies work and what helps us to be effective as human beings in the world, right, is the ability to reflect on an experience and learn from it, and not create the same mistake repeatedly over and over, right? So we go to some of the literature that we've talked a lot about. We talk about single loop learning and double loop learning. And the single loop is the ability to detect and correct errors. That you can just do that over and over and over again and stay in that same loop. And the double loop is the ability to reflect on that error and go, do we want to do this again later? Is this a pattern that we want to repeat again? And the part that I found most helpful as a supervisee, and that your point about managing your own affective state so that you can focus on somebody else's, and the process and the interaction is more focused on what the supervisees need is than the supervisors need, then you start to help people to regulate their internal state so that our brains have that reflective capacity. And so without being regulated, our ability to engage the medial prefrontal cortex to do reappraisal and a little bit of sometimes emotional suppression and get to the point where we actually reflect on something is diminished. We can't do it as well if we don't come at it from a regulated state. And so a lot of the job of a supervisor is to engage in those even short bouts of interaction that are characterized by curiosity and asking questions and understanding where that person is coming from and what their perspective is, in an effort to help them to regulate and get to a point where they can actually use their brain to reflect on an experience and decide if we, get into that double loop of deciding, do I want to do this again? Did this work? What did I learn from it? What would I do better? Like starting to do those kind of questions. I think your point about staying focused on what that person's experience was like is a critical step to getting to that process. A great thing about being a supervisee of Jerry's is you get to watch somebody model it like an expert over and over and over again. And you're like, oh, that's how I do that. So I conjure my inner Jerry often in supervision, where I'm like, oh, I got to do that.
When you just mentioned that, well, thank you. But when you mention that, it kind of brings up, I revisited and read and kind of this concept of Alicia Lieberman's Angels in the Nursery, as opposed to ghosts in the nursery, right? Is everybody brings their own history of where there was relational failures or where somebody was misattuned to you or where, right? But the thing that allows us to kind of deal with that is we also have internal memories of being responded to, of being heard, of being valued, of being right. And so when you have this experience of being with a supervisor who responds to you, who listens to you, who asks you to be reflective, when you're in that stressful situation, you can bring up that professional angel in your professional nursery that helps you stay engaged, right? But if you are dealing with people who are demanding of you, who are not seeing you, who are so preoccupied with their stress, when you're interacting with your client, you don't have that internal resource to hold you while you're trying to manage that. And so it very much parallels having a parent who's dealing with a crying baby, who's screaming, who's doing it. If the only experiences they had growing up was their needs not being met, this experience is painful and I want to avoid it. But if they have an experience where somebody was in their life, soothed them, held them, rocked them, they have an internal kind of template that is, they could stay present with that baby crying that eventually gets them to soothe. So I think that you're bringing up that you having this experience with me, which I very much appreciate, that I also have this experience of being you, of asking questions and being reflective. So now I'm excited to go in supervision. Not all my people I supervise yell and scream at me to kind of do it. Right? So there's a parallel. But I think that's a very important process you talked about, is we need some mentors, professional mentors, that provide those experiences that allow us to kind of tolerate the pain and distress of our work, to kind of looking at that piece. So there's this parallel process that happens in our professional lives.
Yeah, and I think before, I want to make sure people if you're not familiar with parallel processes, I think Jerry hit one of my points, and then Curt, I get what you were going to say, but just so if you're not familiar with that term, it's a lot of times how we take the energy, and this can happen on system levels, or I think Jerry's talking about more individually, but I like to say, and Jerry, let's make sure that my language matches what you were trying to say with this, is a lot of times what I see in organizations is that my relationship with my coworkers, and probably more powerfully even my supervisor, really sets the tone or parallels the quality of relationships I can bring to the clients or patients or students I'm serving. So I always like to set the stage of why I think this is so important, regardless of what your structure is per se, is that there is this kind of contagious nature of emotions that we see can spread throughout organizations. But especially to me, the supervisory relationship is so important, because I saw the better my relationship as a supervisor was with my staff, and I saw this as a staff direct care folks as well when I was doing that work. But the better the relationship I had with my staff, the more regulated they were to create healthy working relationships with those they were trying to help as well.
I think what I was going to say is that one of the ways that I've applied the idea of single loop learning and double loop learning to the area of trauma is to think about, say you got two people in an interaction, right? One's a supervisor and one's a supervisee. Both of them are going to have a need in that moment. Mm-hmm. And so part of that single loop is determining that you have a need and then doing what you need to do to correct that imbalance that you have a need, right? So I feel some feeling, I need to either feel more of that feeling or feel less of that feeling. And so I get in this error detection and correction mode, right? So I'm just meeting my needs and going around the single loop. If the other person is doing the same thing, now I view that as, that's now we get into traumatic reenactment. Right? That's just going around and around and around into that same process. A good supervisor is really one of the greatest resources that you can have to stop that traumatic reenactment. Right? They're the one who can focus in on your experience, and they're not in the single loop. They're able to back away from that single loop and be away from their individual needs and help to look at the context around you, things that you may not notice, right? When we get focused in on a need, then we start to not pay attention to other things in the environment, and we get focused in on that need, right? That's part of our stress response, does that for us. It focuses our attention and gets us organized. And so we stop looking at the larger context. And a good supervisor can both make that problem worse, or they can really do it for a wide group of people. When they're really focused in on the needs of a group or the needs of an individual in any of those interactions, a supervisor has a lot of power to be really positive to that environment and can change the trajectory of interactions across a diverse and wide group of people. And which that plays right into, Matt, what you were talking about as parallel process. Right? Without it, that supervisor creates the same level of disorganization and responding to the single loop at multiple levels of an organization. And with it, they can counteract that. Mm-hmm. So the importance of that, of a supervisory process, I don't know that you could understate it. It's really important from that standpoint. And Jerry, you just say it so well, right? You say it in such a way that connects with people, and how important it is for us to really see and hear one another and understand each other's perspectives. If I can, point to one of the most important things I've learned from my interactions with both of you, it's that. It's the ability to stay engaged, even when we hear things that we disagree with, or even when we have emotional reactions to things. And one of my favorite things that I think Jerry ever said to me one day, got me all activated about behavior analysis versus the world or something like that. And you could tell he was just done with the conversation when he goes, well, the good thing is that it made you think and it made you feel. And I was like, man. I was like, well, that's true. And I guess we're done. And I've used that over and over and over again.
Oh, go ahead, Jerry. Sorry.
No, so I think that the antidote. So there's an inverse relationship between the level of stress that we're trying to manage and our capacity to be reflective, right? And so if you think about it, if the individuals who are closest to delivering the service to the clients that's coming for those services are holding the client's experience, that they're going to be experiencing on a day-to-day basis a significant level of stress. That part of it is theirs, but part of it is they're holding their client, right? Well, the hope is you have a structure that there are people there to help the people delivering the service to in some ways differentiate and explore what is mine and what is theirs. And so that I can then help my client as opposed to being just impacted by my client. Right? This difference between I feel what you feel, which is empathy, right? Is I resonate and I'm feeling your feelings, empathy. Compassion really is I feel what you feel and I have this drive to help you to feel better. Two things, right? So I'm not helpless and powerless. In an organization, you have to have a structure to help people stay in that compassionate place as opposed to getting caught up in this empathy cycle of being overwhelmed and feeling, because the intensity of what our client, if you're working as you met, somebody who's living on the street and is in constant danger, when they come to us, I've got to feel what you feel.
Yeah.
And if I'm somebody who grew up in living in a nice, secure environment to do it, and now I'm dealing with you, I either have to avoid it by just becoming really intellectual in doing it, or I feel like I've got to do something to fix what it is. I can't just be with you and help you. So supervision or a supervisory interaction allows us to kind of get in a place where we can, in some ways, help our clients access the resources that they need so that they can become, in a way, able to identify, tolerate, and manage their experience, right? It isn't about me getting in there and managing their experience. It's about me providing them what they need so that they can manage their experience.
Yeah.
But really and I think that's the role of supervision is really in some ways resourcing the people delivering the services to stay in that kind of sweet spot, to be able to listen, to be able to empathize, but then have compassion and figure out what could I do to help you. And sometimes what's helping is being able just to communicate, I get what you're feeling. As opposed to I'm contaminated by what you're feeling.
Right, exactly. Well, and that's one of the things that when I think about the role of some sort of individual supervision, some aspect of that, because one of the things I think, Jerry, that you mentioned so well, and I think I would really, because I've always tried to integrate supervision into any work environment that I'm in, because I find it my number one management quality improvement sort of tool with folks, especially in their professional development. So one of the things I struggle with is this work can be psychologically damaging to folks. And Jerry, I think you gave good language to that. And one of the things that I never figured out how to do without some type of structured one-on-one time, because I don't think this often comes out in groups, is you don't have to be a mental health therapist, because I see this happen to teachers, medical providers, and everybody down the road who works with individuals struggling with trauma. Is a lot of times this will trigger stuff so deep that, even as a trained therapist who's acting as your supervisor, there's a line that I've said dozens of times is, hey, I want to talk to you about potentially accessing your own mental health services, because this issue with this client seems to be triggering something in you, which is usually unresolved trauma or other things that the person has experienced. So, you know, what I've seen when I've been new to environments, or haven't had that, if I don't have a relationship built with you, I might not identify that problem until it blows up into kind of an HR issue, where all of a sudden you lose it with this client, or you yell back, or you do things you normally wouldn't do because now you're triggered as well. And that's one of the things that I think, if we recognize that this vicarious secondary trauma, all this research burnout that we see coming out on this research, how do we keep folks healthy if we don't kind of have that time to connect? And how do we keep making sure that they haven't, you know, struggling with some of these issues? And I don't think I've come up to a good answer to that question outside, you know, some one-on-one kind of sacred time, as Jerry's talking about, to kind of sit with one another and talk about professional development. There's always some administrative things that might be, hey, you need to get your reports done, sort of thing, but also taking that time to really connect as well. And again, I guess my answer at this point is I haven't found any way to do that and keep staff happy or not healthy in the midst of all this stress that's coming in without that structured sacred time, so to speak.
Yeah, it brings up a challenge, I think, for me in part of what we're talking about is helping people to feel heard and essentially held when we're doing very, very difficult work. And then there's another purpose that kind of needs to happen during a supervisory process, which is learning and learning how to get better at what we do. And that's a challenge, I think, to know when to do which thing and when, you know, when's the right timing. And I think that's a part of the challenge for being a good supervisor, is knowing the difference between those two things and when to do each one.
Yeah, and I think that's ongoing pressure too. I mean, I've seen models as well where there's a clinical supervisor and an administrative supervisor. And I'm not a huge advocate for these, because when I've seen, so the clinical supervisor in this model really just talks about the psychological reactions to the work. It's usually a mental health or MSW sort of level person, where the administrative supervisor is sort of who oversees you in the organizational chart. And while I've seen it work because those two personalities work tremendously well together. I've also seen it fail miserably. And I always like to say, I don't suggest structures to folks as a consultant, technical assistance guys, if it's based on people's personalities clicking perfectly, because I think there has to be so much level of communication in there. But I do acknowledge that I've seen that model work if you do get the right people, that both of those supervisors are on the same page pretty much consistently on a daily basis. But I think it speaks to the fact that we've recognized, at least, that there are some real tremendous parts to the words. And Curt, you might be the person in charge of getting things done, while the clinical supervisor just can kind of hold that space of, you know, emotional, psychological, social support. So I think it's interesting thinking. You know, I've seen it kind of crash and burn enough times to worry about it, but I think, you know, we're searching for those solutions in innovative ways, which I do always like. Oh, go ahead, Jerry.
I was trying to think about what you said about how do I balance learning with reflecting and being with somebody, right? And I'm wondering about, you can't help but learn when you're with somebody and they're reflecting, right? And they're kind of looking at that. And what I think is that when you're really there, paying attention, being focused on your supervisee's internal states and needs, right? And the task that needs to get done, whatever that task is they will start to engage with you and ask you how to do something and what to do, right? And I think the question then really is what's the best strategy to help them to achieve their goal, right? And so sometimes the best strategy is to ask them to kind of think about and reflect on what have they done in the past and what's worked and what hasn't, which is a form of learning, right? Another one is it helpful if I gave you a strategy or a skill to kind of help you to think about this? But in all of those, it really is responding to the need of the person coming to you, as opposed to your need to teach them something or my need to teach. And I know that sometimes in supervision, that's where I get confused. It isn't about when to teach and when to, it's about who's driving this. You know, like you just said something and I know something, so I want to tell you something. It's like, no, I should say is, I have this, would this be helpful for you? Mm-hmm. And then when we're engaged in this cooperative process, that parallels how we want them to be with their clients. So, you know, I don't know that it's a cycle, not a one way or the other.
Yeah.
How do I cycle through these things, as opposed to how do I stop doing this to get to this?
Yeah. And one of the things that I want to throw this out to you to get you guys' thoughts on this too is that I see and have sort of started to really find a soapbox to speak to this, is if you look at research on supervisors in general, and I haven't seen any specifically for the helping professions, though I don't think we would be different from this. If you look at things like when they ask people questions, what's the most stressful part of your job? The number one answer to that question is my supervisor. You know, if you look at what is the number one predictor of engagement at work, which means I like to say is that I'm interested, I'm curious, and I'm passionate about the job I do. It's whether my supervisor cares about my well-being. You know, so you look at, in some ways, and the number is only like 10% feel that of their supervisor. Now, I would hope in the helping professions we're better. I'm not really sure we are. I don't think there's any like say, oh, we've got this thing nailed, because I hear stories that we don't have it nailed. So, you know, there's research out there to say we're bad at supervision across industries. And
Matt, the other part of that research is the number one reason I stay at the place I do is my connections with my coworkers.
Yeah.
Right? So relationships, either bad or good, is what either struggles us to kind of move away from something, but also keeps us connected.
Yeah.
And so really, when they feel connected to their peers and their coworkers, that is soothing and rewarding as well, right? And so that's what I'm saying is, how do you expand the relational support that they feel with their coworkers to this supervisory relationship, not see it either or.
Yeah.
Right? Is that research is really important, because it's all about relationships, not about dollars and cents or cookies or sticks or carrots.
Absolutely. And interesting, like whether or not you have a best friend at work is a huge predictor of productivity and effectiveness and retention. And so you see this, and I'll just throw it out there too, is when we got a bad supervisor, it doesn't mean the team's not bonded. But what I've seen over and over is the team is bonded against the supervisor. Yeah. And I remember my dad was this old school Bobby Knight basketball coach. It's like, well, if you guys ain't gonna like gel as a team, hate me, and like, which was, I guess, fine for my dad. Doesn't really make sense with what we know about relationships nowadays. But it's like, I've been part of, I worked for some really bad organizations in my career. Twice staff organized against leadership and went to the board as this groundswell revolution. And to be part of that, hey, we were incredibly tight as a group of people, but we weren't focusing on care whatsoever. We were focusing on really creating any safety that we could from people we thought were actively hurting those we cared about. So there's kind of that trauma potentially, and I'm careful with the word trauma, but that trauma bonding that can go on, which I don't think is the situations I've been in have been fairly, I would say, traumatic for the folks, us that were in those situations.
Right. So in those situations, when their experience became too much, their solution was to join with another person against somebody.
Yeah.
Which is tribalism.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Which is tribalism. We form this tribe and you're on the outside and we'll be angry at you. But really it's about, we can't manage what we're feeling and what we're dealing with, right? And so there's an inside and an outside. And so that is a solution, right? That's a solution. And that solution has some strengths and it has some real weaknesses to kind of looking at that. And so what you're trying to talk about is then how do I as a organization approach these individuals who are overwhelmed, who found this solution to join with me, who are going to create a state in me now that I'm the enemy and I'm going to use my power and control to get back at you. That goes back to this single loop, right? They're trying to manage. Now I'm going to manage and I'm going to get back at you. Is how do we create the capacity for everyone to be reflective, to be able to say what we're feeling and how to be heard and valued in an organization? That's a trauma-informed, for lack of a better word, organization, right?
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
So in a way, the likelihood of that kind of scenario is greatest when we're dealing with clients who bring in their sources of pain for us to hold. And there's not structures to help people hold those. That's a recapitulation. That's that parallel process, right? So really the question really is how, when you came to me with your source of pain and said, I'm angry at that administrator, how do we help, instead of me saying, good, I'll join you and we'll kill that person, for me to be able to be with you and say, that must be really hard being so angry at that person. What could I do to help you? Right? At all the way up.
Yeah.
So that we create a culture of people who have the capacity to reflect not just the administrator, but a team, that everybody on the team engages in these healthy, which is the sanctuary model of Sandra Bloom's, is that we begin to, we share responsibility for that. We have a democratic process where we empower each other, where we're all responsible for being emotionally intelligent. We create a culture, not just a hierarchical structure that that in some way supports those things. So I think it can be done, Matt, without always thinking that the organizational hierarchy has to kind of, I've got to go to my supervisor, I've got to go. We can create the relational milieu where everybody engages in those practices.
You know, two things that I kind of pulled out of what you were saying, Jerry, is this idea of improving the quality and the overall number of positive relationships is critical at multiple levels, right? That's part of the goal of intervention for anybody who's underwent adverse childhood experience or overwhelming stressful events, right? That's one of the major protective factors that you can do. And doing that from a supervisory standpoint of designing, say, a team or a department or an organization where the goal is to improve the quality and the number of relationships that everybody in the organization can have is really, really a positive direction to go, which I think is another one of those great examples of that. The supervisor, a good supervisor, is organized by the needs of his or her people, not by his own needs or her own needs to be connected with every single person on that team, that it's about their relationship. It's more about improving the number and quality of relationships for the team. Part of that can be giving good clinical skills to somebody or good classroom management skills to somebody so that it improves their relationship with the people that they're with every single day. So there's lots of roads to get to that idea of improving the number and quality.
Exactly. And so, and the reason I'm stressing this is it's very unlikely that you're going to shift schools to have models like a mental health system. So I think that then you have to say is, so what will be the road to get to exactly what Curt just said, right? What's the road to improve the quality of the relationship the teacher has to the students? The relationship that the teacher has with her teammates? The relationship that the teacher has with the principal or the counselors or the kind of, how do we create this relational environment that is optimally designed to have people engaging in the most human part of their brain, the capacity to reflect, problem solve, to envision a future goal, and then to behave in a way to get to that goal. How do we set the conditions at all levels of the organization to achieve that?
Yeah, the thing I struggle with is I think a great principal, a great medical director, even a great social worker or therapist, somebody who can really manage team meetings incredibly well, can kind of knows their staff well enough to, if they just look differently or sound differently, they know there might be something that a great person could potentially create a trauma-informed environment without individual supervision, where you work on building that relationship trust. And I've seen, if you got 3 or 4 teammates in a school that just naturally fit perfectly together, it's a beautiful thing. But if without supervision, it could get pretty ugly at the same time. So the expectation is we might support each other, but we might want to kill each other on a daily basis too. And so what I can't figure out is, if you think about, again, not the great person, but maybe just the average or the above average person, I don't know how you maintain psychological safety, professional development focus, any time of focus on larger goals, much less to keep an eye on vicarious secondary trauma, burnout, without having some strategic sacred spaces. I'm borrowing Jerry words. I wish I could, because then I'd go teach that. I mean, I totally agree that I'm making an argument that is going to at least initially fall on a lot of deaf ears, because how do we move from 0 to what Matt's saying? But I also think, hey, don't be trauma informed then. I mean, in some ways you can train your staff, that's great. But I think if we're going to be realistic of what it means to get further along on your journey, again, for the average normal person who could be good if you had that relationship, I just don't see it. And I think I talked to enough people who are, and I think physicians are interesting, because some of the most educated people are trained. And yet if you talk to them, and a lot of physicians, if they can be honest and slow down for a second, huge levels of vicarious secondary trauma. I'm starting to work with police forces with 0 kind of supervisory structure, huge levels that I see when I look at some of the research out there. So I want to agree. I just have trouble.
But Matt, you look in those structures.
Yeah.
And oftentimes there's nobody in that structure who thinks their role is to be reflective and responsive.
Yes.
They think their role is to have power and control and to get people to do things, right? So even in that structure, if they didn't change their thinking, you would create a time for them to get together, and they'd get in the room and they'd do the same thing they're doing all over. So it's you have to create a mindset vision of how important and valuable the relational interactions are. And then I could create some structures to have it. But if I have people who are in power and control, you could create an hour for me to be with that person, and I'm going to come out of that meeting feeling exactly the way I was when I went in the meeting.
Or
right?
worse,
So
or worse.
Right. So it's more than creating a sacred space. It's about, how do I begin to teach these skills and this way of thinking that takes place in every interaction I have, right? And when I am the head of this organization, every time I interact with the people who work with me is an opportunity for me to have them feel heard, valued, and seen. And then that inspires them to engage in the mission.
Yeah.
Right? As opposed to, I interact with them and I get them stressed, and that engages in the mission of killing me. Right? Or killing somebody else, as you give the model of, when I interact with you and I tell you what to do, then you go away and tell somebody else what to do. Then you go and tell somebody else. So it's more than creating these kind of structures for supervision. It's how do you change people's thinking about how to engage in mindful practices that help people function at their highest level, that will be the place they're most productive.
Yeah.
Right? That's it's not either or. It's not either or.
In your example, I think was really kind of a key point here. And I think the point is about emotional management and emotional intelligence. And so in one of the examples that you gave, you talked about, Matt, I think it was pulling off of yours, where you had a group of people who organized against the leader. Mm-hmm. Right. And when Jerry, when you were talking about that situation, one of the things that I think was really critical about what you said is that you kind of put yourself in the situation of, what if I was talking to one of those people who were angry at that leader? And you asked a question about, that must be really difficult for you to be so angry, as opposed to setting a limit on the anger and saying that that's an inappropriate feeling to have. So for us to think that, I think one of the dangers for us is thinking that if we had the right structures, that we wouldn't have feelings associated with what we do. And that's just never going to happen. Totally. So we shouldn't be surprised by when we have emotions that we need to manage, or when we have affect that we need to help with placement for and context for. And I think that was just a critical point of the example there, that even when we see those things happening, we're not surprised by them. And it's our job to connect with that person and understand what it's like from their point of view, and help them with placement and help them with context. And that's a great, I think, protective factor about the number and quality of social relationships, so that you get somebody who can do that for you. Maybe it's a coworker who can do that for you. Maybe it's a supervisor who can do that for you. Maybe the supervisor can't do it and somebody else needs to do it. So I think that was a critical point.
So Matt, in reframing your question about this supervisory, do you need that, is, how is it that we're structuring our schools, structuring our mental health centers, structuring that is contrary to, remember, it's an inverse relationship between the level of stress we're trying to manage and the level of capacity for reflection. Mm-hmm. How is it we're setting up our classrooms that make it really difficult for a teacher to be reflective and helping kids manage their internal states? And then, how do we begin to look at this from a different problem rather than just supervision? That is, I think, what Curt's saying is, how do we see that, in a way, putting one teacher in a room with 30 immature nervous systems is a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
Right? So even if I came in today and said, oh, let me listen to you, yeah, setting you back into that task where one person is responsible for 30 kids is a terrible model.
Yeah, and I totally agree with you. Absolutely. As a husband of a first grade teacher, absolutely, yes.
Right.
But at the same time, I totally agree. And on top of that, what the educational model that most people work under, and there's not somebody to help me regulate that in a structural way in the school. Now, granted, if my teammates are great and I have that great supportive relationship, I possibly can get that from those folks. If I have a husband that hopefully listens to me and is a good spot when I come home from work to talk about my kids, hopefully I get that somewhere. But you know, that I think is my big point is, and I totally agree. You can have a supervision rich structure with a terrible supervisor and maybe even do more damage than if you didn't have this structure. So it does take a supervisor with some skill and training to do it effectively. Totally agree. But yet I see, okay, we have this teacher. I think we would all agree. It sets that teacher up to have a negative, dysregulated experience. And yet we have that teacher in a structure where they don't get any support from a supervisor to help regulate that in a strategic, proactive way. And I think that's my point, whether it's a teacher or a medical.
Right, but I've had the luxury of sitting with principals who feel like they are responsible for managing this whole school and they're overwhelmed.
Yeah, oh yeah.
Right, and so nobody begins to think about how do we change these interactional processes. Mm-hmm. It's I need these teachers to do something to get these better grades because then I need this right, is everybody's engaged and nobody's really thinking about, we just need to stop and be with each other for a little bit.
Absolutely.
Right. And so I think we have to, as a culture, we have to rethink how we educate children. We have to rethink how we support mothers and fathers doing the job, how we interact with people in our communities. I mean, it's such a large thing, but how I did that is I used to always, at the end of every day, I used to walk, before I went home, I used to walk through my organization and stop in and just talk to my staff. I didn't have to set limits on them. I didn't have to tell them to do anything. I would just go and say, how are you? And how are things going? And they would have, right? And so they became a person to me, and I became a person to them. So when they got full of anger later on, it wasn't so easy for them to project all that stuff and make me just a subject.
Yeah. Right?
Or when something was going on, I didn't think, oh, what the hell are those people doing down there? I knew them. So I would say is, I wonder what's going on down there. I'm going to go talk to them.
Yeah.
Which created a different environment. Now, did it always work? No. But to me that was the goal of how do we create relational connections in this task that we have so that when we get full of feelings, we can come together and not objectify each other.
Absolutely.
Right?
I think that's a great place and a great question to end on for today. And I hope what comes out of this, again, the last two episodes really is to think about if your organization, your program's working to become trauma informed or on that journey, to ask yourself what is the role, how do we create supportive relationships among staff and between supervisors and staff? How do we help people hold the potentially damaging psychological impact of the work? Again, I always like to counter that is there are beautiful things about the work that we get to do every day, but sometimes we get so stuck in the negative side of it that it can become overwhelming. So hopefully we gave you a lot to think about. I appreciate, Curt and Jerry, this conversation because my thinking has been developing on this topic pretty rapidly as well. So I want to thank you guys. And as always, you can find discussion questions and resources and other things at traumainformedlens.org. And we got some fun episodes. We're going to try to do an episode together at the conference. We're still trying to get the details out on that. And a couple, I've got a fun live recording interview set up about trauma-informed communities coming up in the next few weeks as well. So keep joining us, and we hope to see you next week. Thanks, everybody.